If you've been online in the recent months, then you've probably come across this man, Andrew Tate, and his army of ardent followers. Most of them are young men, gravitating towards the former kickboxer turned lifestyle guru and his messaging. On the surface, Tate fans say they enjoy his aspirational content about taking care of your body, believing in yourself, and chasing monetary success. Underneath it, though, is a darker level of messaging, targeting women and feminism, decrying a crisis in masculinity, and encouraging young men to objectify women and prioritize their carnal instincts. For many, Tate was simply another obscure figure on the fringes of TikTok and YouTube. That is, until two recent events brought him into the mainstream. First, his surprise conversion to Islam while on a business trip to the UAE, where he was then embraced by a number of popular Muslim social media figures. Then, just before New Year's Eve, he and his brother were arrested by Romanian authorities and charged with sex trafficking, relating to a webcam business that Tate had often bragged about, but that prosecutors say was built on a system of manipulating, abusing, and blackmailing young women. Tate remains in custody, but continues to use social media to rally support and money from his loyal fans. And it's worrying a lot of people and parents about the hold he and other online agitators seem to have over young people, and in particular, young men. Zahara Chowdhury has been at the forefront of trying to fight this wave of harmful messaging. As an educator, she spent years working with schools across the UK to tackle issues of diversity and gender equality. She's also the founder of the School Should Be blog and podcast, a platform she uses to center students from the ages of 14 and 19, their struggles with adulthood and, quote-unquote, the real world. Zahara Chowdhury, thank you very much for coming. Welcome to the Big Picture.
Thank you for having me.
So, we're here to talk about Andrew Tate, because that's what everyone's talking about. It's what is unavoidably a massive topic of conversation since his arrest, but he also seems to have an ardent group of followers, very loyal, and beyond that is what is concerning is his influence on young people and young men in particular. Yeah. But when it comes to these issues, when it comes to gender equality and safe spaces and misogyny, this is not something that started with Andrew Tate, obviously, and this is something that you have been addressing through your practice for some time. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us about how you got involved in this kind of work and what drew you to it?
Yeah, I mean, being a teacher means that you are involved in this work from the get-go. So I became an English teacher straight out of university, and central to your practice, although it's not potentially taught in a teaching degree, it's referenced in terms of pastoral care, that you have to create a culture of inclusion. As teachers, you start to notice what I guess as children you would just call banter, kids play, boys being louder than girls in some classes, uniform policies, which I guess, you know, you and I went to school, you normalize certain rules and you just accept them. I think you just accept that kids are sponges. So if you tell them, if you tell a girl she's got to pull her skirt down, or a boy has to have his beard out a certain way, or man up, or boys will be boys, that language is normalized. And then when I became a teacher, I don't know how or why. I mean, I come from a family of women anyway. My mum's a single parent. I have two sisters. So female empowerment and career has always been very important. And so when I came into the education environment and I started seeing these sorts of attitudes, you tackle them in lessons. So it was all about navigating those conversations with young people, with colleagues, even for myself professionally, as I climbed the ladder, to say, you know, women deserve as much of a place in the workplace as young women and boys deserve to learn equally and equitably in the classroom. So, and then a few years ago, I'd say around 3 or 4 years ago, I directly got involved in diversity, equality and inclusion. I started blogging about it and podcasting. But at that point, this is pre-George Floyd, at that point it was very, it didn't have a name, I don't think, we just didn't have a name. And now we see these words have become buzzwords, I guess, in all of our...
Diversity, inclusion, representation.
Exactly. Now belonging, culture, workplace culture, vulnerability. Those words just didn't exist even 10 years ago, I would say. So sometimes I feel a bit like a fraud because the work has just been part and parcel of being a teacher and being involved in education and writing and reading. Now it has a name. So it's been quite an organic growth into the work.
As a teacher, as somebody that spends most of your work life in these spaces with young people, and young people at a very critical age in their teenage years, their foundational years, what do you have access to in terms of seeing those parts, those conversations that maybe their parents don't see, the other parts of society don't have access to?
I think what we see mostly is them thriving in a safe space. So we all hate, well, we don't all hate school, but the majority of teens, I think that
I didn't like school.
Well, no, exactly. To be fair, I quite like school, but actually there were so many parts of schools I didn't like, all the bullying, all of the work, the homework, those sorts of bits. But I think students, on the whole, they feel safe in schools, right? That's where their friends are. Yes, if there is things like bullying and stigma, they also want to run away from school, but only if home is a safe space. I've always called school the second home. That's kind of the language around when I started blogging and podcasting, because teenagers come into their own if they are comfortable in the classroom, if they have good, healthy relationships with their teachers. And also teenagers like to be challenged and they need boundaries. And I think sometimes, it's funny, isn't it? Because you train to be a teacher, you don't train to be a parent. So I am trained to deal with teenagers. I am trained to give them boundaries. I'm trained with the language to support them. We don't always have the answers. Equally, as teachers, which parents don't have access to, is the diversity of students. So I'm a parent now. I only have control over my children's home and the experiences I give them and how I nurture them growing up. As soon as they go into school and become one of 30 or one of 150 in a year group or one of 1,200, I have no control of that.
So that idea of the second home, those two homes, and how they intersect, you said you have access to a lot of students who come from vastly different backgrounds. And when you're a student, when you're young, you get half of your education at home and half of your education at school.
Yeah.
And both of these things sort of interact. What does it look like then when you have this mass of students that come from vastly different backgrounds? Some of them might come from, as you mentioned, violent homes or difficult backgrounds. Some of them not from that kind of thing. And then they're in this space where they're essentially treated equally.
Yes,
and given equal access to the same kind of education and attention. Does that create difficulties for students in being able to navigate those worlds and that part of their lives?
Definitely. It creates difficulty for the student. It's like, the way I describe it is one big dinner party, like a really fun family dinner party. Well, I say fun. I found it a lot of fun. I know, but it is hard. It does create difficulties for students because all of a sudden you're putting them into a space at such a young age, at an age where it's such a turning point in their lives, because children are sponges, and so they will start formulating their opinions. They will start thinking, I'm taught this at home. Like you said, 50% of the education is from home. But now at school, these viewpoints and these values are the complete opposite to mine. But I like that person, but I know my family or my friends say X, Y, and Z about that. What do they do? Right? And we've all been teenagers, and there are some thoughts that go through your head which, I don't know, have no answers. They're just thoughts for the sake of being thoughts. And I think now navigating that in the classroom is what's fundamental now compared to academic education is relationships. Because I would say social media and kind of the topic that we're talking about today has been exacerbated by the internet, has given students access to information their parents and even us as teachers would never have dreamed of, right? Like every day the students will mention a new function of Instagram, or somebody told me about Be Real the other day, and they were like, Miss, how have you never heard of Be Real? And my colleague was like, you of all people should know of Be Real. And I was like, oh God, okay, I need to go get familiar with Be Real. So it's like a cacophony of information, overload, young minds who are very intelligent. We don't give them enough credit. Like, they're effectively the future of tomorrow. but equally they're still kids. And they're having to process all of this information. They bring it all into the classroom. And the other thing, sorry, going back to your last question about what else do we have access to? We have access to their relationships with other people. We see how they interact with girls, with boys, with non-binary people, with people of different faiths, people of different racial backgrounds, people from different countries. Every school is different. I've worked in, and I've had quite a diverse career in teaching. I've worked in single-sex schools, I've worked in grammar, education, state, mixed, private. I would say across the board, what is similar is the need for students to be able to trust who's teaching them, to have difficult conversations. Like, they should be able to ask the most uncanny, ridiculous questions in a safe space, knowing they're not being judged, especially young men. Why
do you say especially young men?
Because of toxic masculinity, misogyny, the whole fight around masculine versus female energy, their place in a world where absolutely and quite rightly so, and sexism has also become a buzzword, female power, International Women's Day, which absolutely, I just want to caveat this by saying I am totally pro all of that. I do feel, though, since starting specifically working within DEI work, the consequence of working in DEI is that you can sometimes feel like you're lecturing and saying, this is what you should, and the irony of my blog being called that, but this is what you should be learning, when actually what we should be doing is listening to young men who potentially they're probably like, I don't think that, but maybe I should be thinking that because I'm a boy and that's what society's telling me that I should be. And if I'm not that, not only am I going to be teased by my male friends, the girls might not take me seriously, or all they want to do is belong. And in terms of Tate, and I don't want to focus the conversation too much around him, purely because any teacher will tell you, as much as he is dangerous, he's one of thousands. He has used the media, the art of arguing, the psychology of like fallacy to his advantage. He's excelled on young people's, what they say is their attention span now, which I think is less than 20 seconds, which is quite worrying. That's easy. What he's done is quite easy. Like, when I listen to him, before this interview, I've read what he said, I've listened to some of what he says, it just makes me cringe. And then I think of my students, if they have a safe space to discuss that, I know they might say, well, yes, he's right in saying this, or because of the way he starts his arguments, but with careful consideration and just being authentic and transparent with young people. Once you've built a relationship, they'll be like, yeah, miss, what he's saying is a bit ridiculous. Do you see what I mean? Yeah. So it's almost like you're trying to overcome a history of misogyny from Shakespeare, right? Or from before Shakespeare. When you look at Shakespeare's texts, I used to teach literature, so most of my references are literary. The majority of the school curriculum and literature, much of it is the key themes are misogynistic, or women are the weaker sex, or women need saving, or women do stay at home, or women don't have a name, like Curly's wife, or Othello kills his wife. She's like the pawn in the game. So he has just played on that and made the language non-Shakespearean.
Right, he's modernized it.
He's modernized it. And he's wearing cool glasses and driving a Maserati. And as a young person...
And he's topless for some reason.
Oh, yeah, I don't... Constantly. Yeah. It's just his... Again, I just... When I listen to him, which I don't, can I just say, on a regular basis, but if I hear him, I just imagine being in front of my old classes when I was actively in the classroom, and just being able to say, guys, come on. Are we really? You're way more intelligent than this. You're clever. You've got so much to offer. He is not it. Do you see what I mean?
And the thing is that you are not his primary audience, right?
No.
And that's the thing that I think about when it comes to a lot of social media influencers, a lot of YouTubers that have become incredibly successful, that when I watch, I cringe as well,
Yeah.
And then I have to remind myself that I'm not the audience for this video,
yeah,
and I'm not the audience for this market. That by and large, the consumers and the targets of this type of content are young people and teenagers in particular. What is it about Andrew Tate and others like him that you think appeals to young men of that age?
So I think you have to flip that, because like you said, so, like I've cringed more as I've got older, which is quite sad because then you start thinking of your age. But I sort of tried to flip it and think, okay, what did I admire as a teenager? And I think before this conversation, I mentioned R. Kelly, Michael Jackson, who were, again, men at the top of their game in so many ways. I loved their music. We admired them. We heard the stories about them. But their music sort of, the glamour, the fame, the success, like you can't deny the success, the monetary success, everything that society teaches us. And this is why it's a massive question. What does society show young people is success? What does social media, all of these influences, as much as it isn't down to them, they do have a responsibility to not just showcase the great stuff and the Maseratis or the you know, the gifting, the free stuff they're getting, the PR visits to Dubai, especially when we're living in a time of high inflation, the cost of living crisis. You know, over the last 10 years, I'd say that level of it's been tough for young people, and it's tough for their parents. They've had COVID as well. So what he offers young people is fun. Yeah. And I was thinking about this, and it came up in a meme on my social media, ironically. When we were younger, social media didn't come into play till I think started uni, or maybe just before that, in terms of Facebook, Instagram, and the rest. I think it was like MSN Messenger, maybe. And
you're really taking me back.
I know, right? And you were like, oh, I loved MSN. But what I was thinking of, we used to do at break and lunch times when we first got our mobile phones, we used to create like polyphonic ringtones. Yes. It's really sad, but you were creative. Yeah. You were using your minds to be creative.
That was the height of technology back then.
That was the height of technology, like the 3310. Yeah. But now, what are young people doing? Scrolling. Thumb action. Scroll, get a bit of neck ache. And consuming. They're not being creative. And again, I was speaking to the head of sixth form at the school that I work in at the moment, and she was like, Zahara, I've just had a great idea. One of the students who's struggling, so, you know, mental health is a epidemic in, like, crisis in schools at the moment. We need to get them to do more fun things. We need to get them to engage in hobbies. The fact that schools are now having to actively show young people how to engage in hobbies, like actually make it a lesson. Social media has taken fun away from them. Tate, influencers, influencer culture, social media platforms, how they're clever things, like they're created to serve the way we function. They've duped young people into thinking that's fun. And I think the consequences of that is showing us as adults that, hang on a second, that distraction that I can put Paw Patrol on for my child, or, you know, scroll for a bit and waste a bit of time while I'm waiting at the bus stop, or, you know, do you know what I mean? Like waiting for a friend to turn up for dinner. That isn't fun. All of those micro actions contribute to the impact big influences are having, I guess, on young people and their thinking.
Every single thing that exists out there inside of the Matrix is done so with a purpose. They don't give you the news for free because they want you to be informed. They give you the news for free because they want you to watch it so they can tell you what to think. Every class you learn in school, every TV program you watch, every website you find, all of them are curated to keep your mind inside of a box.
When I was growing up, and especially through those high school years, and again, before we had access to cell phones, but you couldn't really do much.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Definitely, our access to the internet was very limited at that time. But when I think about the kinds of role models that I had, it was either people that I was seeing on TV, or maybe reading about it in magazines or something. But the rest of it were just people in my real life, whether it's my parents or family or people at school, my peers, my teachers. And the amount that the media that I was consuming was impacting my life was very limited. And then nowadays, when you talk about, spending 3 to 4 hours at least a day on your phone, scrolling through social media, all of a sudden the kinds of content that I'm consuming, me as an adult per day, is really eating up so much of my social interactions, my interactions with the world. And for young people whose social media presence is much heavier and much more interacted, how does that change then the function of their brains in terms of thinking about themselves and who they are, but thinking about their adult selves that they are now being asked to consider as teenagers?
Yeah, it's a really good question and really good insight, actually. Like, I hadn't even thought of that from a role model perspective, that yes, influencers are their role models. And unfortunately, because work life has increased, I think, for parents potentially, our absence from the home, longer commute times, parents travelling abroad sometimes, or parents just not being present, yes, has reduced that. So where do they find that? They find that on social media. How that's had an impact on their minds? Well, if we think, like, I think I read a little while ago in a book that's called There's No Such Thing as Naughty. It's a book for toddlers. And I, working within the well-being space as well, there was a point in there. And again, I'm not quoting this as scientific fact, but I read it to say the amygdala, so the bit that kind of controls our emotional sense and self-awareness, doesn't actually form until we're like 12 to 14. So that period of time is critical in terms of young people's self-awareness, critical thinking, evaluation. Social media, unfortunately, like scrolling, takes that away from them, because it takes away self-awareness, because they are then aware of what other people are doing. And if young people are sponges and their minds are sponges, you subliminally start to take on board, well, if a young woman must look like that, then I'm also a young woman. I'm not saying it's as like clear cut as that sort of, but over time that's what they take on board. I guess the way I'd compare it for us is maybe looking at Disney, maybe looking at music, what was glamorized for us when we were younger, and it was that kind of top of the pops music culture. However, we had breaks. Like you said, we didn't have access to the internet all the time. My mum pretty much controlled the TV. Yeah. Do you see what I mean? Yeah. Like, and she was present. So
our parents read our browser history.
Exactly. There was one computer that was stationed downstairs that everybody had like half an hour to 45 minutes on, or something like that. Young people now, that they cannot. Well, yeah, they can't cope with. Like, I think we'd be be silly to think they can cope with that level of information that's thrown at them. And equally, from a school's perspective, because information overload has grown and what's expected of young people has sort of increased. They get emails, they get notifications from school, from their parents, even from a career development standpoint, they need to be volunteering, they need to be they need to be doing after school clubs. Who do they see at those after school clubs? Like even sports clubs, there's in terms of going back to the idea of misogyny, and we've got to tackle it not just online but offline too. So when they're playing football on the football field, is it equitable? What kind of language are they using there? What nicknames are they using with one another? You need to call all of that out.
One of the things in the messaging of these kind of male-focused influencers, people like Andrew Tate, is this idea of undermining the conversation around misogyny, but toxic masculinity in particular.
Yes.
This idea that toxic masculinity isn't a real thing, and that the more we talk about it, the more we're actually undermining what it means to be, quote unquote, a man. Mm-hmm. When you speak in these spaces, when you speak to young people, but also to schools and to parents, and you talk about the idea of toxic masculinity, how do you define it?
So that's a really good question. So toxic masculinity is effectively stereotypes that have been taken out of context in many ways, negative stereotypes, which then fuel a negative, dangerous, concerning image of what it means to be a man. So if we think about masculine and feminine energy, masculine energy is seen to be as strong. You're the leader. If you go back to even caveman sort of theory and ideology, men were the hunters, women stayed at home and took care of the children, for example, or the food would come back to them, and they would. So that toxic masculinity has taken that caveman. And again, this is something else to talk about. The idea of toxic masculinity as almost, sometimes I'm like, I don't even know what it is anymore. It's almost just like, sometimes it feels like man bad. Do you know what I mean? Like, and I think that's very dangerous for young men. So toxic masculinity is effectively looking at masculine energy, exacerbated negative stereotypes, and how they play out in literature, in real life, in maths, in career, in economics. And fact is, over time, women have had, there's been a disproportionate amount of injustice against women. Violence against women is at an all-time high, for example. We look at what's happening around the world. War, women and children are the ones who are always disproportionately impacted. So toxic masculinity feeds in all of those arguments. When influencers try to deny it, I think what they are trying to deny is not, what they're trying to say is not all men.
Yeah.
And that's not exactly what Tate is saying, but he's playing on that. Like his arguments are.
He's almost flipping that upside down.
Yes,
It's going from not all men to this is an attack on men.
Yeah.
That this is an attempt to try and undermine men.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. And I think, and that kind of thinking about it back into the classroom and for young people, it's scary being called out. It's quite, when you're told as a teenager you're wrong, I remember it, you go red, don't you, in the face, or if you put your hand up to give an answer and your teacher's like, not quite, you do naturally just go red and think, I've made a mistake. And there's that major fear of failure. And I think masculinity, people like Tate, in many ways, have glamorized it as being a failure. So for young boys, you put on the defense and you're like, well, actually, if he's creating a culture of belonging for me, if there are influencers online who are getting, like clickbait, loads of likes, and I can laugh at what they're saying, and when I comment, I get a like, and kind of see where they're coming from, for whatever reason that might be, he's got a following.
Yes, he had specific views that Islam didn't agree with. But when he accepted Islam and those joined together, alhamdulillah, he gives the solution. And thousands, I believe he's responsible for thousands of people coming to Islam. Thousands, if not millions, right? And that's why we know where he is now. Yes? Yeah, until proven guilty.
One of the things that has been happening recently, which people are starting to get a little bit uncomfortable about, is not necessarily his mainstream following when it comes to young men, but his kind of almost niche
I think I know what you're going to
following
say.
within the Muslim community.
Yes.
Among young Muslim men in particular.
Yes.
And through your work, you speak to a lot of schools with large Muslim classrooms and cohorts. And what is your take on that? What do you think has been happening, and why do you think young men, young Muslim men in the UK and other places are being drawn to somebody like Andrew Tate, apart from the fact that he is now a Muslim?
So, Andrew Tate has mastered arguing and conviction. And I think there's some, again, don't quote me on it, there's some psychological research to say that if in your first sentence you make a really great argument, you might say, all Muslims are great, or the way Muslims treat women is amazing, or people it's like a hook, isn't it? It hooks you in. And Tate has done that very, very well. I got it, he's mastered that kind of art. And I remember when I was at school doing English, not that any student should do this, but my English teacher, and it was very settling, she said, Zahara, if your first paragraph and your last paragraph are on point, you can really trick the examiner. Now, just to caveat that isn't exam advice.
This is not advice
for It's not advice for any students. But do you see what I mean? So that's what Tate's done. With regards to, now I speak to some, I wouldn't want to say that I speak to loads of schools. I have to say it's very reactive, because students do a lot of stuff that's off the radar from their parents and their teachers. Like, for example, lots of schools have no mobile phone policies. So, and that's rightly so to protect students. So then we don't really know what kids are seeing. Yeah. So in terms of Tate's conversion to Islam, his appeal to young Muslim boys, lots of parents and adults are like, how? Where has this come from? What he has done, I think, if you look at the wider context of Muslim children in schools, Islamophobia is rife. They do feel like a targeted group with regards to discrimination. So it's hard being a Muslim at school. It's hard being a Muslim teacher. It's hard being somebody with that identity with regards to microaggressions. And when you see what's going on around the world with regard, if we look at Afghanistan, the Middle East, even if you go back as far as 9/11, if you're a Muslim at school, I was a Muslim student at school at that age, all of a sudden you start to withdraw a little bit. You don't want people to know who you are. Tate has come along and given that group a sense of belonging. Actually, you matter. Actually, I really like your faith. I'm going to put, I was looking at his Twitter feed, and again, it just, if you analyze it, every 5 or 6 tweets, there's a bit of Quranic scripture. And God knows how many thousands of likes. Because when you look at that out of context, a Muslim student, and they're young, I think we are, again, as much as they're really clever and intelligent, and I have a lot of time for every student, they need help, like we all did, navigating and understanding media and how to criticize and evaluate real versus fake news, for example. But again, if you see a man tweeting what reads, because, the Quran is a wise and wonderful piece of scripture, it reads amazingly. Oh my God, yes, that's what I believe. Follow. He's got you.
Yeah.
That's it. That is genuinely it. And then for Muslim, again, a lot of the pressure is falling on schools. Where are their parents? What's going on at home? And it's a very uncomfortable conversation because, again, misogyny and patriarchy within the Islamic faith and Muslim communities, just like it is in any other faith and community. I don't want this to feel that, I'm just talking about Islam. That's something to be tackled as well. So, for example, I recently joined a book club on women and gender and Islamic studies led by Dr. Sophia Rahman. And one of the chapters of the book that we're reading, she's going to kill me for forgetting the name of it. That's really bad, isn't it? I've forgotten the name, but it's by the Musawa movement. And the whole story is about the Prophet and his first wife's relationship and how she enabled him.
Yeah.
Why are we not teaching that story
She
to
was
young
the
boys?
breadwinner. She was much older than him. She was a successful businesswoman. He really relied on her for a lot of even social acceptance within the community at the time. Yeah.
Why are we not teaching that to kids? Where is that in the home? You see what I mean? I don't know whether, and equally, even if it is in the home, when you do see someone like Tate, why is that story not being, and why aren't, when Tate did convert, I think one thing I found very problematic is, and again, it might have just been my social media feed, but there was quite a few Muslim prolific figures saying we should channel forgiveness and we're not ones to judge his conversion. And I have to say, even I was like, oh my God, I'm a Muslim. Am I judging? Am I judging? Am I because of my, and what they're doing is they're kind of manipulating and using your faith against you. They're gaslighting you, right? Where have they all been since his arrest? Now, I know that it's all alleged or whatever you want to call it. Nothing's in. Where are that's my question to them now, saying why.
And where is that spirit of generosity for the potential victims of someone like Tate?
Exactly. Where? So that, I think that's where you flip it when it comes to Muslim young boys. And again, if you get them on side, by that I mean build trusting relationships with them. Don't and this goes for teachers of all faiths and backgrounds, don't just kind of paint them with the same, Muslim, therefore, your heads go to particular spaces, particularly like 9/11 and the Middle East, and in terms of the negative vibe, just, kind of question your bias against those young men, because they know it and they feel it and they are going to go somewhere where they belong instead. And Tate's created that environment for them.
He's given him a sense of belonging.
Absolutely, yeah.
As a parent, how do you navigate this same subject? Outside of your role as a teacher, as an educator, do you feel a sense of added pressure when it comes to trying to navigate the minefield of online?
So my husband and I talk about this a lot, or I talk about it a lot, and he has to listen. And it's really hard. My son is very young; he's not at school yet, and I'm trying really hard to give him, and both of us, not just me, my husband and I, are trying to instill forgiving values, community values, Islamic values into him. Equally, for him to know that the home is like his strong point, like we will give him that balance of education. And as long as he feels safe in our home, whatever comes up at school, he knows there's somewhere where he will be accepted, he belongs, but in a way that he's not going to get away with anything. Like, he has to be a good human being. He has to do good, not just be good. He has to be kind, be giving. Kind of what's his public service as a Muslim? It's really difficult. So one scenario that came up, which is very much linked to toxic masculinity, I was reading him a book, which was all about emotions. Because I really want him to know that he can show emotion and be vulnerable. And he looked at me, and he's only 3.5. And so he's just started talking, like, not just, but, conversation. Yeah. He was like, "Mummy, you cry." And I was like, "Oh, no." It's like, he's seen me cry. All of a sudden, the mum guilt kicks in. And I was like, yeah, but he's, I'm also happy. And then he goes, "And I cry." And I was like, "Yes, you cry a lot." And he said, "Daddy never cries." And I looked at him, and he was like, "Daddy just works." And then I was like, "No, but Daddy, Daddy can." And I was like, actually, he's never... Apart from seeing his father happy and provide and be an amazing, amazing role model, where's the vulnerability? And then he was like, "It's okay, you cry and I cry, but Daddy doesn't cry." And then Daddy came downstairs and said, Daddy has to be strong.
Well, how important do you think it is to be able to challenge teenagers about their beliefs? And, I mean, maybe some of the more harmful ones as well.
Yeah.
But versus how much space do we allow them to explore different ideas and figure out where they stand?
I think, so that's quite a difficult question, because one, when we say challenge beliefs, as teachers in education, we are also have our boundaries and safe, we sign up to a code, really. So if a child walks into my class who is Muslim, for example, or Christian or Jewish, who am I to, challenge or question them? And that's not what you should be doing, because, it's a protected characteristic. And I think, so that's why it's quite dangerous, because you might have, and I think this has happened in many classrooms, maybe, that a teacher or an adult might come to the conversation with their bias of that faith, of those belief systems. It's, and I won't deny it. When I started teaching in a mixed school and tall boys walked into my classroom, hadn't even said anything to them, I was a little bit intimidated. That's my bias coming into play. I should be like, "Hi guys," like, do you know what I mean? Like, so I think it's really important to challenge your own bias first before you challenge a teenager's, because you have to go to the conversation with kindness and with a totally clear mind, and a forgiving mind, because equally people need to say things to then be able to unlearn and rectify sometimes. I do think it's really important to challenge them.
Your conversations with parents, your
Yeah.
advice to parents who might be watching all of this stuff and just freaking out. I don't know what my child is consuming. I don't know where they're getting their messages from. I don't know how to interact with them if I don't have the same social media algorithms as they do, if I'm not on TikTok, if I don't have the same interactions. And I think, the idea that you feel like you're in a completely different world now. What advice do you have to parents to make them feel a little bit calmer about this, but also to feel like they have more involvement in their teenager's life?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like, I would say you need to flip the narrative and go back to what it was like for you as a teenager. So empathy is really key. And I think as parents it's very easy, and I know we do sort of forget what it was like to be a child. We think we don't, but actually we do. It's that kind of what do they call it? Like, when they say you've done a degree, so you think you're an expert in it, but you did the degree 20 years ago and you can't actually recall anything about it. It's that same bias, I think, that sometimes we have I have it as a parent. So I think it's really important, firstly, that parents need to have empathy and be forgiving and enter those spaces and those conversations knowing that it's not going to be resolved in the first chat with your child. You do need to, I would almost say to parents, you do need to be familiar with the social media platforms. Not all of them, and I know even I have to shut down from some of them. I don't know all of them. There's new ones popping up all the time.
Be real.
Be real. Then there was Clubhouse at one point, and I remember there was all the hype about Clubhouse. So you need to be familiar with it. It's also really important just for a parent to reassure their child and remind them of doing good, of kindness, of forgiveness. There's no need to hate. There's no need to be mean or unkind to girls, for example, or boys. And if they are scared, they've got somewhere to go. I think that's really important. So parents need to approach they need to become familiar with the platforms. They need to approach the conversations with empathy and kindness. And also they do know. Sometimes I think parents don't give themselves enough credit. I'm like, if your child was to, I don't know, tease their younger brother or sister and say something nasty, you'd call it out. Or you might let them try and figure it out, but then you'd call it out, right? Do the same. You can apply that same thinking to social media. Equally, there's a really good book by Shea Yokowo called How to Stay Safe Online. I'd highly recommend that to parents. I've read it in terms of the practical steps it offers on keeping kids safe online. So you don't necessarily have to, if you don't want to go on TikTok, maybe that's something that can help you. Parents can, with simple steps, look at social media optimistically. Just follow, even if you were just to Google positive accounts for young men, I'm pretty sure you'd get a really great list. And just say to your child, oh, I've heard this guy, just click follow. Do you see what I mean? I think it is possible for us to overcome the algorithm. But who knows? We'll see what happens.
Overcoming the algorithm.
Yeah.
Zahara Chowdhury, thank you very much for your time today. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Thank you for watching this episode of The Big Picture. Please let us know your thoughts in the comments below. How do you feel about this conversation surrounding young men and their interactions online, about misogyny and toxic masculinity, and of course about Andrew Tate? And until next time, salam.